Welcome back to Movies TV Mad. I'm Mick, your host with the most to start your girlfriends and your wives. A very warm welcome to Monday. Yes, Monday already. Monday's edition of the DCU Daily. You can follow me on X, Twitter at Movies TV Mad, and on Instagram and on Threads at Movies TV Mad X. How the MCU destroyed the DCEU and cinema. It was crazy to me at the time when the Snyderverse movies were being released into cinemas, Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman. Some of the hate that mainstream critics and mainstream audiences had for those movies, real movies with passion and effort. They were so contemporary and beautiful, with beautiful scores, with beautiful storytelling. And people preferred the MCU. Top Rotten Tomatoes scores, top box office. Not that Man of Steel's box office was a disaster or that Batman vs Superman's box office was a disaster. It weren't the money the studio wanted, but the studio wanted that MCU dough, those MCU Rotten Tomatoes scores. The MCU turned everything into, let's say, a measuring contest. It became about Rotten Tomatoes scores. It became about people loving it rather than good movies. We went from great art, and I'm not just talking about the DCEU in cinema generally. We went from admiring great art to admiring the MCU. Now, I enjoyed the first three phases of the MCU, but they're not cinema. I never thought they were cinema. I never felt that the MCU style should be cloned and that should be what cinema should be going forward. God forbid, heaven forbid, what a nightmare. And that's exactly what happened. Because DC nerds started saying, we want to be like the MCU. We want everyone to love us. We want those Rotten Tomatoes scores. We want that huge box office. So the MCU became the franchise, the most successful franchise of all time, that weren't particularly great movies. The MCU were like McDonalds. You'd go there, you'd have your quarter pounder, your Big Mac, your strawberry milkshake, your McFlurry, right? And you feel a little bit bloated afterwards because you know it ain't good for you. You know it's rotting your guts, but you're still doing it. That is exactly what the MCU was, where the Snyderverse was this meal that's actually good for you, that educates you, that gives you something, that is utterly art. But all of a sudden, it wasn't about art anymore. It was about the MCU. It was about cameos. It was about Easter eggs. It was about post-credit scenes. That's what cinema became. And people like Grace Randolph, John Campea, the people on Collider were championing the MCU as cinema and making a lot of money on views in the meantime. Cinema became about cameos, Easter eggs, and post-credit scenes. It wasn't fashionable to watch art anymore. Think about, I'm 52, I don't know what ages you are. I grew up on TV with Little House on the Prairie, The Waltons, Highway to Heaven. I've been rewatching Beauty and the Beast starring Linda Hamilton and Ron Perlman. 5 minutes and I'm blubbering. Great score, great acting, great idea. And then you had the movies, Dead Ringers, Casualties of War, Silence of the Lambs. They were our blockbusters for a time. Imagine that. Deep movies that weren't about CGI and effects, but had a deep story to their core. The very opposite of what the MCU was. It gives me great pleasure to see the franchise on its knees right now, because what we're seeing now is an audience that hungers for cinema, real movies, and real stories. because it was absolutely hurtful to someone who writes and directs and acts to see what was happening. For the DCEU, for Man of Steel and Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice to be trashed while the MCU was being hailed for something it wasn't. They were calling it great cinema, and it's laughable. It's laughable. Do we all remember the Martin Scorsese op-ed piece for the New York Times? I actually read it on here. It's a long piece and it was full of facts, and a lot of people got very angry with Martin Scorsese. Kevin Feige, the MCU, James Gunn came out and said, well, I respect you, but I think you're wrong. Of course you do. You were part of the MCU. You're trying to create the MCU 2.0 with DC now, and I don't personally think it's going to work. I say every day, the future of comic book movies, both Marvel and DC, should be solo, individual projects done by people who care about what they're doing. People who are not making content and product, but want to make art. This Superman movie, what we're going to see, whether it's good or not, will not be art, it's content. And it's to create more content behind it. That's why that movie is happening. This is a change to what entertainment used to be. Think about the pioneers. Think about who built entertainment. Charlie Chaplin, Stan Laurel, Harold Lloyd. The titans of industry that built up these studios. They weren't making content. They were creating an entertainment industry. And I know they've always been utterly problematic with their illicit practices and their too cultural system, while pretending they're inclusive. But we tolerated them and all their practices because at the very least, they were entertaining us. We don't tolerate Hollywood and the entertainment industry as a whole and all their nonsense now because they don't entertain us. And you just see the hypocrites. I look at the Actors Guild's awards they did last night, and it's laughable to me that an industry is handing itself awards, right? The only people who should be voting for awards are your consumers, are your public. That is the biggest award you can get. Not your peers voting for you, voting for each other. That's meaningless. It means nothing. And that's why award season means nothing to me, especially if you're giving each other awards in the most bland, untalented, dull, boring era in entertainment history. Your industry is collapsing on the floor. A lot of people will tell you it's wokeness that destroyed entertainment. And there's an element of the extremism we see, the extreme political narratives we get today in entertainment that have helped harm entertainment, the constant spilling of tea. We see it online all the time. The historical stuff they talk about, they're so negative. It's so negative these days, isn't it? And they're not celebrating their own industry. But away from that, it's the MCU that destroyed everything. And then you had WB executives saying, well, we don't want this Snyder here. We don't want these real movies, because WB actually liked Man of Steel when they viewed it. WB executives loved Batman vs Superman, loved it. They thought it was the next Dark Knight. They thought it was amazing. They loved it. It's a great movie with some great talking points to it. Great action, great character moments. It's a little bit controversial, right? I get it. But it doesn't make it a bad movie. And it can divide opinion. But for people, this generation, to call Man of Steel trash, to call Batman vs Superman trash, is because they were watching, they were eating their quarter pounders and didn't want anything that was good for them. Anything that was art. And that's very interesting because if you release Man of Steel and BVS and the Snyder Cut, and I said this at the time when I was doing my DCEU dailies and debating all this, if you release Snyder's DC movies, even Watchmen, in the 80s, the 90s, you know, even the 70s, right? They're going to be lauded as great cinema. But oh no, not in the 21st century. And this is how the MCU not only damaged the Snyderverse, the DCEU original plan, and because of the MCU, they didn't allow Goya and Nolan and Snyder to cook. It's the team of those three men. Once they were separated, the DCEU was over. Because it was those three guys who cooked with Man of Steel. It was the studio who wanted to put Batman and Superman together in the next movie. It wasn't Zack Snyder. Zack Snyder had to deal with it. And he did. He made his own movie and he got Chris Terrio to write it. A fine, fabulous movie about hatred, rejection, and how a good person deals with hatred and rejection. It was amazing. It was amazing. For me, it was amazing. For me, I enjoyed it. I liked the contemporary tone of the Snyderverse instead of repeating the same old thing. All Gunn's doing with this Superman movie is going, they like this, right? They didn't like this, we won't do that, right? Although, it does seem to have some similarities, the film, to the Snyderverse. Seems like he's ticked those boxes as well. And it seems like WB are a little bit intimidated by the Snyderverse as well. I don't think we're getting a Superman movie. We're getting Superman's greatest hits, as I've said before. But the MCU damaged everything because then every studio went after the MCU formula. WB took down the Snyderverse and were chasing the MCU formula. And no one was able to capture that success. And I said at the time, Pepsi-Cola can't repeat the exact flavour of Coca-Cola. Everyone does their own things. Now, the MCU failed because they went down an extreme political avenue instead of doing something fresh, you know, going to a new Earth, you know, developing of the Fantastic Four and X-Men universe on a different Earth, moving away from the Earth that set up the original Avengers and all of that, right, phases 1 to 3. They weren't ambitious enough, right, because Disney started making, you know, narrative decisions and interfering with what Feige was doing. And if I was Disney now, I would just do individual Marvel projects. But they're not going to do that. They're going to keep on pushing this MCU, and it will never be as successful as it once was. People are done with franchises. They want real movies back. If you look at the movies doing really well right now, it's not the ones that are part of franchises. Horror is doing quite well right now. Individual movies are doing quite well. I mean, you could say Bridget Jones is part of a franchise, but it's not the MCU, is it? That's doing well. I mean, they haven't done a Bridget Jones movie for years because it's an individual solo story, the continuing story of one woman's journey, right? And people are still intrigued by that. People want to see real movies. All they want you to do, right? We're sick of it. We're sick of, oh my God, this cinematography is amazing. This VFX is amazing. F that. All I want to see is someone pointing a camera at actors and actors acting and telling us a story and creating characters that we're interested in and stories that we're interested in. That's what cinema was. That's what cinema should be. The number one thing that entertainment should be is varied. And all of a sudden, everyone wanted cinema to have blonde hair and blue eyes. In other words, be like the MCU. Every movie should be like the MCU or it sucks. That's why they were saying the Snyderverse sucked, because it wasn't like your quarter pounder and your chips and your McFlurry and your thick, creamy milkshake. And that's what went wrong, and that's went wrong with the DCEU. The DCEU, the Snyderverse, didn't actually do anything wrong. Its big sin, its big crime, according to all of you, or a lot of you, was that it wasn't the MCU.